Kia ora everyone, thanks for coming back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've still got a fairly upbeat labour market coming through, strengthening further according to the latest numbers. Unemployment rate falling to 4.7%, further reduction overall. More people getting back into work, but still quite a lot of people, and in fact a rising number who are underemployed. Their underutilisation rate also ticking up. So what we're seeing is that people may well be getting back into a job, but overall still looking to do a bit more where they could. That's also quite true when we see the likes of part-time work, which has increased quite significantly. Full-time work, though, actually dropping a touch. So under the undercurrents, if you will, through the labour market, not quite as firm as you'd like to see. But given the bounce back since that big COVID-19 hit, things are quite impressive. But looking forward, there are some concerns around where the labour market might head, and importantly, what direction people within the labour market might move towards. We've got this Oz bubble that's opened up now. Is there a risk that we see a brain drain like we saw after the global financial crisis?
Yeah, it is interesting if you look at the numbers over the last few years. Between 2015 and 2019, Australia's unemployment rate has been on average 0.8 percentage points higher than ours. And during that period, the net outflow of Kiwis heading across the Tasman has averaged about 7,000 per year. If we look historically, if you look over the previous decade prior to that, the net outflow had averaged over 30,000 per year. So it just shows you that the relative performance of our labour market compared to Australia's is really important in determining the flows of people going across the Tasman in either direction. So at the moment, Australia's unemployment rate 5.5%, ours is 4.7%. So it's in line with that sort of average of the last 5 years or so. So at this stage, I wouldn't be too worried about a sort of an economy-wide brain drain with people rushing across the Tasman for better opportunities. But there are some risks or some issues to highlight. One is in something like infrastructure, where the government is having trouble getting the money out the door. And we know there's strong demand in terms of both infrastructure activity and also how the mining sector and iron mining in particular are going over in Australia there. And so demand for work is showing through. The other factor that probably concerns me a bit at the moment is just living costs. And particularly as they relate to housing in New Zealand versus Australia. So we know, look, our house prices have risen massively over the last couple of years, and that follows on from a decade where they have been rising pretty quickly. But it does mean that, look, if New Zealand incomes are on average probably a little less attractive than Australia's, you're faced with higher rents or higher mortgage costs than you would be across the Tasman. Look, if those job opportunities across the economy do start to open up more fully throughout Australia, then I would start to be concerned about just what those migration flows might look like over the next 2 or 3 years. So at the moment, not an issue, but gee, keep watching those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, look, nurses is probably another area that I'd highlight as a potential in terms of where the relative pay sits, in terms of where job opportunities are, particularly with nurses at the moment not getting much traction with DHBs and the government around their pay expectations and pay parity and similar. So I think, there's, like I say, there's a few sectors. It's not broad across the entire economy, but certainly some areas that are looking at that pattern. Related to that, I guess, we're talking about possibly New Zealanders heading overseas. Real struggle, though, still to bring in people, skilled migrants, to help fill some of our own skill shortages across the country. And I guess the expectation is that probably doesn't change a huge amount as we move forward. We've got managed isolation and quarantine facilities, which are quite underutilised at the moment, and not a huge amount happening from the government. They've freed up a bit more space, but the actual number of vouchers that are being used there's still a lot of spare capacity in MIQ. And related to that, we recently, in Budget Week, a few weeks back, had an announcement or a speech. It wasn't an announcement, as it turned out, from the Immigration Minister, Chris Farfoy. He was sick that night, so Economic and Regional Development Minister Stuart Nash delivered the speech. Look, I was there in person, and I must say I came away incredibly confused, as did everyone else in the room, around what the expectation and outlook for our skilled migration settings look like. We heard a bit around how New Zealand wants to bring in more wealthy investors to spend a bit of cash locally. That was sort of pretty well signalled ahead of the game, but no new announcements around what the expectation was for migration settings. The clear signal was that they will be tightened up quite a bit as we move forward, but you know, some erroneous claims around how skilled migrants keep wage pressures lower, and all of these other sort of half teased out facts and figures, if you will, from the government, again leaving everyone in the room, and importantly businesses and industry, without a clear view of how they might be able to fill some of their skills gaps. And related to that, there's this concern that, look, in 5 years' time, we might be able to get our own domestic talent pipeline ready to go and provide some of these skilled workers. Over the next 5 years, though, very, very difficult to fill some of these supply gaps, these skills gaps locally, because we just don't have people ready to go. That could well hinder our economic ability into the future.
Yeah, the rhetoric from the government does very much seem to be focused on trying to make sure that New Zealanders are filling jobs as much as possible. And yet, you talk, there are skill shortages already in place. It takes time to train up people, like you say. And then we know that once the unemployment rate gets down to about 4% or below that, that the pool of unused workers or unemployed workers that you're drawing on there, very few of them are actually genuinely work ready in any sense of the word anyway, and it's very hard to integrate them into the workforce, into the labour market. The other part of the equation the government seems to like is, well, if you can't source workers, then maybe you're going to go and invest in plant and machinery and improve the sort of productivity outcomes of New Zealand over the medium term. Well, that's all well and good again for larger businesses, but my experience and certainly talking with people is that smaller and medium-sized enterprises don't necessarily have the access to finance to be able to do that. They don't probably know a lot of the technology that's available out there, and indeed the sort of equation or the recipe for them of not relying so much on workers and not looking after the people they've had working for them in many cases for many years is not the path they necessarily want to go down. And ultimately, New Zealand's productivity performance has been pretty woeful for a long period of time. So it's the kind of outcome that, while the government may be trying to engineer it, I'll actually believe it when I see it, and I don't think they've necessarily put the steps in place for that to be achieved. They're just trying to turn off one of the taps and force people down a route which probably, let's be honest, is not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like you say, those skill shortages have already emerged across parts of the economy. So the challenge is already there. We know that net migration inflows into New Zealand have fallen quite dramatically, plummeted over 90-odd% from an average around about 6,000 incoming per month to less than 600. So there's a big shift in terms of already what we're seeing, hearing it across industries, that concern about actually being able to move forward, how they can't find the right staff. All of these issues already present before we even start thinking about sort of what tomorrow brings, what the reopening and such looks like. So look, I think we'll have to keep an eye on where the labour market heads, who's in it, what they're doing, and where they might be heading next. And we'll update everyone on one of our next editions of Econ Talks.